The wind was a blade against Alara's cheek, honed on 1,000 miles of unforgiving prairie. It carried the dust of her past and the bitter chill of her future, and it found every frayed seam in her father's worn coat. Each gust was a physical blow, a reminder of her solitude in the vast, indifferent expanse of the Wyoming Territory. The sky was a bruised and swollen purple, pressing down on the land, promising a snow that would not just cover, but consume. Her world had shrunk to the rhythmic creak of the wagon's axle, a sound that had been a comfort just weeks ago, a lullaby of progress and hope. Now, it was a death knell. The left rear wheel, splintered and useless, leaned into the frozen mud like a broken bone. The oxen, gaunt and listless, had long since ceased their lowing. They simply stood, heads bowed, their breath pluming in the frigid air, as if they, too, had surrendered to the inevitable. Despair was a cold, heavy stone in the pit of her stomach, a weight that made the gnawing hunger seem a distant, secondary ache. She had been alone for 6 days. 6 days since her mother's fever had broken in the worst possible way, her last breath a ragged sigh that the wind had stolen before it could even settle in the wagon's cramped space. For days since her father, his shoulders stooped with a grief too immense for his frame, had simply sat down by the fire and not gotten up again. He hadn't been sick, not in the way her mother had. He had just stopped. The life had drained out of him like water from a cracked vessel, leaving behind a hollow shell that Alara had buried beneath a cairn of stones, her own tears freezing before they could trace a path down her face. She was 17, and she was the last of them. The provisions were gone. A handful of hardtack, a few slivers of jerky. She had gnawed on the last of it yesterday, the salty leather a poor substitute for sustenance. The cold was relentless, seeping through her boots, her coat, her very bones. She could feel it slowing her down, making her thoughts sluggish and thick. The sun was a pale, watery disk sinking toward the jagged teeth of the distant mountains, and with its departure, the temperature would plummet. To stay with the wagon was to die. To walk was a fool's hope, but it was the only hope she had. She had seen a flicker, hours ago, far to the north. A smudge of smoke against the bruised sky. It could have been anything, a hunter's fire, a band of Indians, a trick of the failing light. But it was a direction. It was a reason to put one foot in front of the other. She pulled the thin wool blanket from her mother's bedding, wrapping it around her shoulders over the coat. It smelled of lavender and sickness, a scent that brought a fresh wave of grief, so sharp it made her gasp. She took nothing else. The family Bible, the silver locket, the carved rocking horse from her childhood, they belonged to a life that was over, to a girl who had died with her parents on this desolate trail. She was something else now, a creature of pure survival, driven by the most primal of instincts. Her feet were numb as she started walking, her boots crunching on the frost-hardened ground. The world was shades of gray and brown, a dead landscape under a dying sky. The wind whispered lies in her ear, promises of warmth and rest if she would only lie down, just for a moment. She clenched her jaw, focusing on the memory of the smoke, a fragile anchor in the swirling vortex of her fear. The silence was the worst part. It was a living thing, vast and predatory, broken only by the shriek of the wind and the frantic, terrified beating of her own heart. Every shadow seemed to move. Every skeletal tree seemed to watch her with malevolent intent. She thought of wolves, their eyes gleaming in the dark. She thought of the stories she'd heard at trading posts, of travelers found frozen solid, their faces masks of surprise. The hunger was a physical pain now, a fist clenching and unclenching deep inside her. Her vision began to swim, the horizon blurring. She stumbled, catching herself on a low-hanging branch that scraped her cheek, the sharp sting a welcome distraction. It proved she was still alive, still capable of feeling pain. She pushed on, her world narrowing to the next step and the next. The darkness fell not like a blanket, but like an executioner's hood, absolute and suffocating. The moon was a sliver, hidden behind a scrim of fast-moving clouds. And then, she saw it again. Not smoke this time, but a light. A single, defiant point of yellow in the overwhelming black. It was small, impossibly distant, but it was real. It was a candle in a window, a lantern on a porch. It was a sign of life. A surge of adrenaline, cold and sharp, cut through the fog of her exhaustion. She fixed her eyes on the light, her beacon, her salvation. Her pace quickened, a clumsy, shuffling run. She fell, her knees hitting the frozen earth with a sickening crack, but she scrambled up, ignoring the searing pain. The light was her entire world, the only thing that mattered. Closer now. She could make out the dark, hulking shape of a building behind it. A long, low ranch house. A fence line, stark against the faint starlight. The smell of wood smoke, rich and real, reached her, and it was the most beautiful scent she had ever known. She was sobbing, ragged, silent gasps that tore at her raw throat. She didn't have the energy for proper tears. She reached the fence, her numb fingers fumbling with the rough-hewn wood. The house was 50 yards away. The light in the window was a warm, welcoming eye. She stumbled through the gate, her legs giving way. She crawled the last few feet, her hands raw against the frozen dirt and gravel. She reached the porch steps, her body a dead weight she could no longer command. With the last of her strength, she pulled herself up one step, then another. Her hand reached for the rough plank of the door, and she knocked, a sound so faint it was barely a whisper of knuckles on wood. Then the world dissolved into a swirling vortex of black, the yellow light of the window fracturing into 1,000 pieces before vanishing completely. Her last conscious thought was not of her parents, or of the life she had lost, but of the impossible, heartbreaking scent of baking bread. She awoke to the sensation of fire, not the consuming flames of a prairie blaze, but a deep, penetrating heat that seemed to be pulling the very marrow from her bones. It was a painful, prickling thaw, 1,000 needles dancing across her skin. She was lying on a rough wooden floor, a coarse wool blanket thrown over her, and the source of the heat was a great stone hearth to her right, where a fire roared and spat, its orange light painting the room in flickering, monstrous shadows. The room was large and stark, furnished with a long table, several sturdy chairs, and little else. The walls were unadorned logs, the ceiling high and raftered. It was a place of function, not comfort. A man's space. A shadow fell over her. She flinched, trying to push herself up, but her limbs were heavy and unresponsive. A figure stood silhouetted against the fire, a giant of a man, his shoulders so broad they seemed to block out half the light. He was unnervingly still, watching her with an unnerving intensity. He said nothing. He simply stood there, a towering monolith of silence. Fear, cold and sharp, cut through the haze of her exhaustion. This was the man who lived here, the owner of the light. She had thrown herself at his mercy, a mercy he might not possess. He moved then, his steps heavy on the plank floor. He knelt beside her, not close, but near enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. In the firelight, she could see his face. It was a hard face, carved from granite and weathered by sun and wind. A thick, dark beard covered his jaw, and his eyes, deep set beneath a heavy brow, were the color of a winter sky just before a storm. They held no warmth, no pity. They were flat, assessing, and utterly unreadable. He held a tin cup of water, which he extended toward her. His hand was huge, the knuckles scarred, the fingers calloused. She stared at it, her throat so dry it felt like it was lined with sand. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out. Her own hand was a pathetic thing by comparison. Thin, chapped, trembling uncontrollably. She could barely hold the cup, and water sloshed over the rim, cold against her skin. She brought it to her lips and drank, the cool liquid a shock, a miracle. It was the most profound relief she had ever known. She drained the cup in 3 long, desperate swallows. He took the empty cup from her without a word and rose, disappearing into the shadows at the far end of the room. He returned with a piece of bread, dark and dense. He didn't hand it to her. He set it on the floor beside her, as one might leave food for a stray animal. The scent of it made her stomach cramp with a pain that was almost unbearable. She snatched it up, her movements clumsy and feral, and devoured it. She didn't taste it, didn't chew it properly. She tore at it with her teeth, forcing it down her raw throat. When it was gone, she looked up at him, a wild, cornered thing. The silence stretched, thick and heavy as the wool blanket covering her. He was waiting. For an explanation, for a plea. She had to say something, had to give him a reason not to cast her back out into the killing cold. Her voice, when it came, was a stranger's, a dry, rasping croak. My family. She had to stop, to swallow against the lump of grief and dust in her throat. The wagon, it broke. They're gone. She couldn't bring herself to say the word dead. It was too final, too heavy to be spoken aloud in this strange, intimidating place. The man's expression did not change. Not a flicker of sympathy, not a hint of curiosity. He just watched her, his gaze unwavering. She felt like an insect under his scrutiny, her entire miserable existence laid bare. She was a burden, a stray, another mouth to feed in a land where every mouthful was earned with sweat and blood. He would tell her to leave at sunrise. She knew it. The thought sent a fresh wave of terror through her. She had nowhere to go. The snow was coming. To be outside tonight was to freeze. She had to offer something, anything. What could she possibly have that a man like this would need? She had no strength for labor. She had no money, no connections. She had nothing but the skills her mother had drilled into her since she was old enough to stand on a stool and stir a pot. The desperate words tumbled out, unbidden, whispered into the vast, silent room. I can work. Her voice was stronger now, laced with a thread of desperate resolve. I don't need much. A corner to sleep in. Scraps. She pushed herself up further, onto her elbows, trying to meet his gaze directly. I'm quiet, mister. I won't be a bother. She paused, taking a breath, gathering the last of her courage for her final, most important offering. But skilled in kitchen, the words hung in the air between them, a fragile, hopeful prayer. It was the truth. Her mother had been a marvel in the kitchen, able to conjure feasts from the barest of larders, and she had taught Alara everything she knew. It was the one thing of value she possessed. The man's gaze flickered for the first time, a subtle shift. It moved from her face to her hands, thin and scraped, but with long, capable-looking fingers. He looked back at her face, his eyes lingering on her for a long moment. He was weighing her words, weighing her. The silence returned, more profound than before. The fire crackled, a log shifted, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. The wind moaned around the corners of the house, a desolate sound. She held her breath, her entire future balanced on his unspoken response. Finally, he gave a single, curt nod. It was not a welcome. It was not an act of charity. It was a transaction. He turned and walked back to the fire, taking a seat in a heavy wooden chair that groaned under his weight. He picked up a piece of leather and a knife and began to work, his focus absolute, as if she were no longer there. He had not told her to leave. It was enough. It was everything. Exhaustion, potent and sudden, washed over her. The warmth of the fire, the water and bread in her belly, the reprieve from the freezing wind. It was a potent combination. Her eyelids grew heavy. She sank back down to the floor, pulling the rough blanket up to her chin. She was safe, for now. She was in the house of a silent, formidable stranger, a man who looked at her as if she were a piece of livestock to be evaluated. But she was inside. And as she drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep, the last thing she was aware of was the steady, rhythmic sound of his knife scraping against the leather, a sound that was not threatening, but methodical. It was the sound of work, the sound of survival. The morning light was a pale, anemic gray, filtering through a single grimy window and doing little to dispel the gloom of the main room. Alara woke stiff and sore, every muscle protesting the ordeal of the previous day and the hard floor she had slept upon. The fire in the hearth had been banked, its embers glowing a dull, angry red. The giant was gone. For a panicked moment, she thought he might have left her, abandoned her to her fate. But a heavy coat was missing from a peg by the door, and a pair of mud-caked boots were gone. He was out there, in the cold, working. The silence of the house was different now. It wasn't empty, it was waiting. It was her turn to fulfill her part of their unspoken bargain. Pushing the coarse blanket aside, she stood on shaky legs. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she braced herself against the rough-hewn table. The hunger was back, a dull, persistent ache. But it was overshadowed by a more powerful force, purpose. She had made a claim, and now she had to prove it. She looked around the room, truly seeing it for the first time. It was meticulously, almost obsessively, tidy. The floor was swept clean, the few pieces of furniture were free of dust. But it was a sterile tidiness, lacking any touch of warmth or life. There were no pictures on the walls, no books on the shelves, no small personal effects that would speak of the man who lived here. It was a shelter, not a home. Her domain, the kitchen, was not a separate room but a corner of this main space, defined by a large, cast-iron stove, a dry sink with a hand pump, and a set of rough plank shelves. It was as stark and functional as the rest of the house. A film of greasy dust covered everything. A stack of dirty plates sat in the sink, and a blackened coffee pot rested on the cold stovetop. It was a space used for a single purpose, fueling a body, with no thought given to pleasure or comfort. It was a challenge. She found a rag and worked the pump until a stream of icy water gushed out. The cold was a shock, but it helped clear her head. She washed her face and hands, the simple act of cleaning herself a reclamation of her own humanity. Then she set to work. She scrubbed the plates until they shone, scoured the coffee pot until the black soot gave way to dull metal, and wiped down every surface of the stove and shelves. It was hard work, and her body ached. But with each small act of order she imposed on the neglected space, she felt a piece of her own shattered self clicking back into place. Next, she took inventory. The larder was a small pantry off the kitchen corner. It was as she had expected, meager. There were sacks of flour and cornmeal, a barrel of dried beans, a few shriveled potatoes and onions in a bin, a slab of salt pork hanging from a hook, and tins of coffee and salt. It was the diet of a man who ate to live, nothing more. There were no spices, no sugar, no small luxuries. But it was more than she'd had yesterday. It was a starting point. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. Waste nothing, Ilara. A clever cook can make a feast from a handful of dust and a good fire. She built up the fire in the stove, her hands clumsy with the flint and steel, but she managed it. The warmth that began to radiate from the iron was a comfort, a living presence in the quiet house. She decided on a simple bean soup, something that would simmer all day, filling the house with a savory aroma, a promise of warmth and sustenance to come. She put the beans on to soak and then turned her attention to bread. Using the last of the bread he had given her as a starter, she mixed a dough of flour, water, and salt. Her hands, though stiff and cold, remembered the motions. The kneading was a familiar rhythm, a comforting cadence of push, fold, turn. As she worked the dough, she felt a sense of ownership over this small corner of the vast, intimidating house. This was her place. Here, she was not a helpless waif. Here, she had skill. She had value. Hours passed. The soup began to simmer, the scent of onions and salt pork mingling with the smell of the wood smoke. She shaped the dough into 2 loaves and set them near the stove to rise. The house began to feel different. The air, which had been cold and sterile, was now thick with the smells of cooking. It was the scent of a home, however temporary, however fragile. She found a broom and swept the entire room again, not because it was dirty, but because the act of doing so was a way of claiming the space, of making her presence felt in a way that was useful, not intrusive. She was just finishing when she heard the heavy tread of his boots on the porch. The door opened, and he entered, bringing a blast of frigid air with him. Silas Blackwood. She had heard the name from another traveler weeks ago, a name spoken with a mixture of fear and respect. The owner of the Broken Spur Ranch, a man who kept to himself. He stopped just inside the doorway, his massive frame filling the space. His eyes, the color of winter, swept the room. They noted the clean floor, the roaring stove, the simmering pot. He sniffed the air, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement. His gaze finally settled on her. She stood by the stove, her hands covered in a light dusting of flour, her heart hammering against her ribs. She felt small and terribly vulnerable under his silent scrutiny. She had invaded his space, changed it. He might be angered by her presumption. He said nothing. He walked over to the wash basin, removed his heavy coat, and hung it on its peg. He rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearms thick with muscle and corded with veins. He pumped water and washed the grime of his work from his hands and face, the movements economical and precise. Then he sat down at the head of the long table, his back to the fire. He still had not spoken a single word to her. He simply sat and waited. Her hands trembled slightly as she took a clean bowl from the shelf, ladled it full of the thick, fragrant soup, and tore off a hunk of the bread she had set aside for him. She placed it before him on the table. He looked down at the bowl. It was simple fare, just beans and a bit of pork, but she had taken care with it, coaxed every bit of flavor from the meager ingredients. He picked up the spoon she had set beside the bowl. He took a mouthful. He chewed slowly, deliberately. Alara watched, holding her breath. His face remained a mask, impossible to read. He took another spoonful, and then another. He ate the entire bowl of soup and the hunk of bread without pause. When he was finished, he pushed the empty bowl away and looked at her. For the first time, there was something other than cold assessment in his eyes. It wasn't approval, not exactly. It was a flicker of acknowledgement, a recognition of a skill rendered, a bargain upheld. "There's work to be done in the barn," he said, his voice a low rumble, like stones grinding together. "The roof leaks over the east stall. Find what you need in the lean-to. Fix it." It wasn't a request. It was an order, and it was more than she could have hoped for. It was an acceptance. It meant she was staying. She gave a small, jerky nod, not trusting her voice. He rose from the table, put on his coat, and walked out the door, back into the unrelenting cold. Alara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She looked at the empty bowl on the table. It was a trophy, a testament to her survival. She had a place here, for now. She had work. And in this harsh, unforgiving land, work was life. The days that followed settled into a quiet, unvarying rhythm, as stark and predictable as the winter landscape itself. Alara's world was the kitchen, the hearth, and the small tasks Silas Blackwood assigned her. His world was the vast, snow-dusted expanse of the ranch, a domain of half-wild cattle, frozen fence lines, and relentless labor. Their orbits intersected at meals, brief and silent exchanges of sustenance for effort. She would rise before dawn, the air in the great room so cold her breath would mist before her. Her first act was always to coax the embers in the hearth and the stove back to life, pushing back the oppressive chill. The fire became her companion, its steady warmth a comfort in the profound silence of the house. She would make coffee, strong and black, the way he seemed to prefer it, and put a pot on the back of the stove to stay hot. Then she would prepare breakfast, usually oatmeal or flapjacks made with cornmeal, served with a piece of fried salt pork. He would enter as the first light touched the eastern peaks, stamping the snow from his boots on the porch, his face ruddy with cold. He would eat quickly, without a word, his focus on the food absolute. Then he would rise, nod once in her direction, a gesture that was neither thanks nor command, but simply acknowledgement, and leave for the day. Her days were filled with the quiet industry of her craft. She learned the quirks of the iron stove, where the hot spots were, how to bank the coals to maintain a slow, even heat. She explored the meager larder like a treasure hunter, finding ways to stretch the provisions, to introduce variety where there was none. She made stews that simmered for hours, the tough cuts of venison or beef he occasionally brought and rendered tender and flavorful. She baked bread every other day, the scent of it filling the house, a constant, warm protest against the sterility of the place. She discovered a small root cellar under a trapdoor in the pantry, finding a forgotten crate of winter squash and a few jars of pickled beets, treasures that felt as precious as gold. She learned to communicate with him without words. A mended tear in his work shirt, left folded on his chair, would be met the next day with a brace of grouse left on the kitchen stoop. When she found the axe handle splintered and dangerously worn, she left it on the table for him to see. That evening, a new, smoothly sanded handle was leaning by the door. It was a language of necessity and observation. She watched him from the kitchen window as he worked. He moved with an economy of motion, a strength that was both powerful and controlled. Whether he was splitting firewood, his axe rising and falling in a hypnotic rhythm, or calming a spooked horse with a low murmur and a firm hand, there was a deep competence about him. He was a man perfectly suited to this harsh environment, as rugged and enduring as the mountains that framed his land. He was an enigma. She knew nothing of his past, of how he came to be alone in this vast, empty place. The house held no clues. There were no feminine touches, no signs that a family had ever lived here. Yet, in a locked chest at the foot of his bed, a room she only ever entered to leave clean linens, she once saw, through a crack in the lid, the corner of a small, embroidered sampler. It was a fleeting glimpse, but it was enough to plant a seed of curiosity. Who had stitched it? A mother? A sister? A wife? The thought of a wife brought a strange, unwelcome pang. The few ranch hands, grizzled men who lived in the bunkhouse 100 yards away, kept their distance. They would come to the main house for their evening meal, which Alara would leave for them on the long table. They ate in their own rough silence, their eyes avoiding hers. She was an anomaly, a lone woman in this world of men, and they seemed unsure of how to treat her. She heard them talking sometimes, their voices carrying on the still, cold air as she gathered kindling. They called him the Major, a military title. It would explain his bearing, his discipline. It also deepened the mystery. One afternoon, a heavy snow began to fall, thick, wet flakes that quickly blanketed the world in white. Silas came in early, his beard and eyebrows crusted with ice. He didn't go back out. The storm settled in, the wind howling, rattling the window panes. The world outside the cabin disappeared into a swirling vortex of white. For the first time, they were truly confined together, the vastness of the ranch shrinking to the four walls of the main room. The silence, usually a neutral space between them, became charged, heavy with their proximity. He sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle, the metallic clicks and scrapes the only sounds besides the shrieking wind. Alara sat at the far end of the table, mending a sack of flour. She kept her head down, her needle moving in small, precise stitches, but she was acutely aware of him, of the breadth of his shoulders, the intensity of his focus, the sheer, imposing fact of his presence. She felt a strange tension, a mix of fear and a fledgling sense of security. He was a formidable, intimidating man, yet in his house, with the storm raging outside, she felt safer than she had in months. "The snow will be deep," he said, his voice startling her. It was the first time he had initiated a conversation about something other than work. She looked up, surprised. "Yes," she managed, her voice quiet. "It will be," he finished with the rifle and began oiling the stock, his large hands surprisingly deft. "We have enough wood. Enough food." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. A reassurance, perhaps, though his tone was as flat as ever. "I made a squash soup," she offered, the words feeling clumsy in the air. From the cellar, he glanced at her, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. "Good." The word was clipped, but it felt like praise. The evening meal was eaten in their usual silence, but it felt different. The storm outside created a sense of shared isolation, a small bubble of warmth and light against the vast, chaotic darkness. After they ate, he did not retreat into his work immediately. He stared into the fire, his jaw tight, his eyes distant. Alara watched him, her curiosity warring with her ingrained caution. She saw something in his face then, a flicker of profound sorrow, a shadow of a pain so deep it seemed to have been carved into his features. It was there for only a moment, a crack in the granite facade, and then it was gone, his expression once again closed and impassive. But she had seen it. He was not just a hard man. He was a man who had been hardened by something. He had a history, a story buried as deep as the foundations of the mountains. That night, as she lay on her cot in the small pantry space she had claimed as her own, listening to the wind scream and the house groan around them, she did not feel like a stray. For the first time, she felt like a resident of the broken spur, a small, quiet part of its story. The silent man in the other room was no longer just her intimidating benefactor. He was a fellow survivor, a person with his own ghosts, sharing this small sanctuary against the storm. As the deep winter slowly released its grip, giving way to the muddy, hesitant promise of spring, Alara's presence on the broken spur became a quiet fact, as ingrained as the morning frost and the evening wood smoke. Her small garden, started with a handful of seeds she'd found in a forgotten tin, began to push tentative green shoots through the cold earth. The sight of them filled her with a fierce, protective joy. They were a testament to her own resilience, a small patch of life she was coaxing from the hard land. The rhythm of the ranch changed with the seasons. The work became more urgent with the thaw. Calving season brought sleepless nights and a constant, low-level tension. Silas was gone for longer stretches, riding the far boundaries of his property, checking on the new mothers and their vulnerable offspring. He would return late, bone-weary and grim, covered in mud and smelling of the herd. Alara would have a hot meal waiting, no matter the hour. She learned to read the state of his day in the slump of his shoulders, the tightness around his eyes. A successful day meant he ate his meal with a slow, steady pace. A difficult one, where a calf or a cow was lost to a cougar or the cold, meant he barely touched his food, pushing it around his plate before rising and heading out to the barn, seeking solace in more work. One evening, he returned with his left arm held stiffly at his side, his shirt torn and stained with a dark, alarming patch of red. Alara's heart lurched into her throat. He brushed past her without a word, his face pale beneath its weathered tan, and slumped into the chair by the hearth. What happened? The words were out before she could stop them. It was the first time she had ever asked him a direct, personal question. He didn't look at her. He stared into the fire, his breathing shallow. A new bull. Got cornered against a fence post. He spoke through gritted teeth. It's just a gash. It was clearly more than a gash. She moved toward him, her usual caution overridden by a wave of alarm. Let me see, for a moment. She thought he would refuse, would push her away with a gruff dismissal. But he hesitated, then gave a short, pained nod. With trembling fingers, she helped him shrug out of his heavy coat, and then carefully tore the blood-soaked fabric of his shirt away from the wound. It was a deep, ragged tear in the flesh of his upper arm, oozing blood. It would need stitches. I need hot water. And clean rags, she said, her voice gaining a firmness she didn't know she possessed. She fetched her mending basket, pulling out her sharpest needle and a length of strong thread. Her mother had taught her this, too, on the long journey west, tending to the cuts and scrapes that were a part of their daily life. While the water heated, she cleaned the wound as gently as she could. He sat rigid in the chair, his jaw clenched, but he did not make a sound, did not flinch away from her touch. His stillness was a form of trust, and the weight of it settled on her shoulders. She sterilized the needle in the flame of a candle and began to sew. Her stitches were small and neat, just as her mother had shown her. The work was gruesome, the needle piercing his skin, the thread pulling the raw edges of the wound together. But her focus was absolute. She was aware of his closeness, of the heat of his body, the faint scent of leather and sweat and blood. She was aware of the ripple of muscle under his skin as her fingers brushed against him. It was the most intimate contact they had ever shared, a proximity born of pure necessity. When she was finished, she bandaged the arm tightly with strips of a clean flour sack. Her hands were shaking, but a sense of profound competence filled her. She had not panicked. She had seen what needed to be done, and she had done it. She had been useful in a way that went beyond the kitchen. Thank you, he said. The words were a low rumble, spoken to the fire, but they were clear. It was the first time he had ever thanked her for anything. You should rest, she said, her voice softer now. I'll see to the stock, no? I can manage. He tried to stand, but a wave of dizziness, visible even in the dim light, made him sink back into the chair. You can't, she stated, her tone leaving no room for argument. Just for tonight. Tell me what needs doing. He looked at her then, his storm-gray eyes searching her face. He saw not a timid girl, but a determined young woman. He saw strength. After a long moment, he sighed, a sound of pained resignation. He began to speak, his voice tired, giving her a list of simple, essential chores, checking the water troughs, throwing hay for the horses, ensuring the new calves were sheltered. She listened intently, nodding, committing each task to memory. She put on her father's old coat, which was still too big for her, and pulled on a pair of work gloves she had found. As she reached the door, she paused and looked back at him. He was watching her, his face shadowed, his expression unreadable. But she felt a shift in the air between them, a change in the very foundation of their arrangement. She was no longer just the cook he had taken in out of some cold, pragmatic form of pity. She was a capable part of the ranch, a partner in its survival. The barn was dark and smelled of hay and animals. The horses nickered softly as she entered, their large, dark eyes watching her. She moved with a quiet confidence, her fear of the large animals overcome by the urgency of her task. She worked methodically, her movements sure and practiced, just as she had seen him do 100 times. She was not as strong as him, but she was efficient. When she was finished, she stood for a moment in the barn doorway, looking back at the warm, yellow light of the house. The world was quiet, the sky brilliant with stars. A sense of peace, deep and profound, settled over her. She was not a victim of her circumstances. She was a survivor. She was strong. And she was, for the first time since her family had died, beginning to feel like she was home. The incident with the bull marked a subtle but profound change in their dynamic. The carefully maintained distance between them began to shrink, eroded by the shared vulnerability of that night. Silas's arm healed slowly, and for weeks he was forced to rely on her for tasks that required two good hands. She helped him harness the draft horses, her small hands working the stiff leather buckles. She held fence posts steady while he hammered with his good arm. She learned the names of the horses, the particularities of the different cattle bloodlines, the signs of a coming change in the weather. He began to talk to her, not often, and never about anything personal, but about the ranch. He would point out a distant ridge and explain how the snowmelt there fed the creek in late summer. He taught her how to read cattle tracks, to distinguish the print of a wolf from that of a coyote. His words were always practical, instructional, but they were a form of sharing. He was teaching her his world, inviting her into the knowledge he possessed. Alara, in turn, found her own voice. She would tell him about her garden, about the blight affecting the potato plants and the remedy she had concocted from wood ash and water. He would listen, his head cocked slightly, his gaze thoughtful. He built her a small cold frame to protect her seedlings from late frosts, a silent acknowledgement of the importance of her work. One afternoon, a traveling peddler named Silas Jones, a cheerful, talkative man with a wagon full of wares, stopped at the ranch. His arrival was a rare event, a break in the monotony of their isolated lives. While Silas Blackwood bartered for salt, coffee, and ammunition, the peddler turned his attention to Alara. "Well now, Major, you've been holding out on us," Jones said with a broad grin, his eyes twinkling. "Didn't know you'd taken on such a pretty housekeeper." Alara flushed, uncomfortable under the man's friendly but appraising gaze. She saw Silas stiffen, his hand resting on the axe handle leaning against the porch rail. His expression darkened, the familiar storm clouds gathering in his eyes. "She's not the housekeeper," Silas said, his voice low and flat, carrying a clear warning. "She's my partner," the peddler's grin faltered. He looked from Silas's grim face to Alara's surprised one. "Ah, I see. My apologies, ma'am." He quickly finished his business and departed, his cheerful chatter noticeably absent. The word echoed in the quiet air after he was gone. Partner. It was a simple word, but it was monumental. It defined her role here in a way nothing else had. It gave her a standing, a legitimacy. It was a shield he had raised for her, protecting her from the casual assumptions of the outside world. They didn't speak of it. They went back to their chores as if nothing had happened. But the word lay between them, a solid, comforting weight. Alara began to see the man behind the granite facade more clearly. She saw the way his eyes would soften when he watched the newborn calves frolicking in the spring pasture. She saw the care he took in mending a broken leather strap, his large hands working with patience and precision. She learned that his silence was not a sign of anger or disapproval, but a natural state, a deep-seated habit of a man who had spent too much time alone with his own thoughts. His past remained a locked room, but she was beginning to see the shape of the door. The name the men used for him, the Major, and his rigid self-discipline spoke of a military background. The profound, fleeting sadness she had seen in his eyes spoke of loss. She pieced together a story in her mind, a story of a soldier who had seen too much of the world's ugliness and had retreated to this remote corner to find a measure of peace. It was a story that made her feel a deep, aching sympathy for him. One evening, as she was clearing the table after their meal, her hand brushed against his as she reached for his plate. The contact was accidental, fleeting, but it sent a jolt through her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. She pulled her hand back as if burned, her cheeks flaming. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. The air grew thick, charged with an unspoken awareness. It was a new and bewildering feeling for Alara. In her old life, she had thought of boys, of dances and courtship, in the vague, storybook way of a young girl. But this feeling was different. It was not girlish fancy. It was a deep, quiet recognition of the man before her, his strength, his solitude, his unexpected kindness. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes too, a surprise, a confusion, a mirror of her own sudden turmoil. He looked away first, clearing his throat and rising from the table. The moment passed, but it left a permanent mark. The nature of the silence between them had changed again. It was no longer just comfortable or companionable. It was now laced with a delicate, fragile tension, a question that neither of them dared to ask. The ranch was their world, a self-contained universe of hard work and shared survival. But now, a new element had been introduced, a possibility that was both terrifying and wonderful. She felt it when he watched her tending her garden, his gaze lingering longer than necessary. She felt it when he handed her a tool, his fingers brushing hers, the contact now deliberate, questioning. And she knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and frightened her, that he felt it too. The quiet ranch hand and the silent major were standing on the edge of a new, uncharted territory. The fragile peace of their evolving partnership was shattered by the arrival of three men on horseback. They were not travelers or peddlers. They were hard-faced men with guns holstered on their hips and a predatory stillness about them. Alara saw them first from the kitchen window, a cloud of dust on the horizon that slowly resolved into the shapes of riders. She felt a prickle of unease. Visitors were rare, and these men did not look like they were paying a social call. She called out to Silas, who was in the barn sharpening an axe blade. He came to the door, wiping his hands on a rag, and his body went rigid as he saw the approaching riders. "Go inside," he said, his voice a low, urgent command. "Bar the door and stay away from the window." The tone in his voice, a cold, dangerous edge she had never heard before, sent a chill of real fear down her spine. She did as she was told, her hands trembling as she slid the heavy wooden bar into place. She retreated to the back of the room, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She could not, however, keep herself from peeking through a small crack in the log wall. She saw Silas walk out to the porch, his movements calm and deliberate, but she could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. He stood at the top of the steps, his powerful frame blocking the doorway, a silent, immovable guardian. The lead rider, a tall, thin man with a cruel twist to his mouth and pale, reptilian eyes, pulled his horse to a halt a few yards from the porch. The other two fanned out on either side of him. "Blackwood," the man said, his voice a mocking drawl. "Still hiding out here, playing at being a rancher?" Silas said nothing. His silence was more intimidating than any threat. "Mr. Grissom sent us," the man continued, patting the neck of his horse. "He's getting impatient. He made you a fair offer for this land. He's not a man who likes to be told no. The land is not for sale," Silas said, his voice flat and cold as river stone. The man, Cain, as she would later learn his name was, laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. "Everything's for sale, Major. It's just a matter of price. Mr. Grissom owns most of the valley. He wants the water rights that come with this parcel. He's going to have them, one way or another. Tell Grissom to come himself if he has business with me," Silas said, his gaze unwavering. Cain's eyes narrowed. He let his gaze drift over the house, lingering on the kitchen window where he must have known Alara was watching. A slow, ugly smile spread across his face. "Heard you've got yourself some company. Getting lonely out here, were you? Maybe the lady has more sense than you do. This is no place for a woman." The insult, aimed at her but intended to provoke Silas, hung in the air. Alara felt a surge of hot anger. This was her home. These men were invaders, their presence a violation. She saw Silas's hands clench into fists at his sides. He took a single, deliberate step forward. "Your business is with me," he said, his voice dropping to a deadly growl. "Leave her out of it. Now get off my land." Cain held his gaze for a long moment, the smile never leaving his face. He was enjoying this, enjoying the power he held. "We'll be back, Blackwood," he said softly. "You can't watch every corner of this ranch at once. Accidents happen. Fences get cut. Cattle wander off. Fires start." He wheeled his horse around, and the three of them rode away, not with the urgency of a retreat, but with the slow, arrogant confidence of men who knew they had the upper hand. Alara watched them go, her fear mixed with a cold dread. This was not over. It was just the beginning. When they were out of sight, Silas came back inside, his face a mask of controlled fury. He didn't look at her. He went to the large wooden chest in the corner of the room, unlocked it, and pulled out a repeating rifle and several boxes of cartridges. He began methodically cleaning the weapon, his movements sharp and precise. The quiet domesticity of their lives had been shattered. The threat was no longer the abstract dangers of the wilderness, the storms, the predators, the accidents. It was a human threat, born of greed and cruelty, and it was aimed directly at them, at the life they had built. "Who is Grissom?" Alara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Silas paused in his work, his knuckles white as he gripped the rifle. "A man who thinks his money gives him the right to own everything and everyone," he said, his voice tight, with a loathing so profound it seemed to vibrate in the air. "He's been trying to buy me out for a year. He wants the water from the upper creek. What will we do?" she asked, the "we" coming naturally to her lips. His fight was her fight. His home was her home. He finally looked at her, and the fury in his eyes was tempered by a deep, weary sorrow. "I don't know," he admitted, and the words seemed to cost him a great deal. It was an admission of vulnerability she had never expected from him. He was the major, the unbreachable fortress. But even fortresses could be besieged. That night, the atmosphere in the house was thick with unspoken fear. They ate their meal in a tense silence, the familiar comfort of their routine gone, replaced by a constant, listening watchfulness. Every creak of the house, every howl of the wind, sounded like an approaching threat. After dinner, Silas didn't sit by the fire. He took the rifle and went outside, positioning himself on the porch where he could watch the approaches to the ranch. Alara watched him from the window, a solitary, determined figure silhouetted against the deepening twilight. He was protecting her, protecting their home. The sight filled her with a fierce, painful ache. She thought of her father, who had simply given up, whose spirit had broken under the weight of grief and hardship. Silas was not like that. He would not break. He would fight, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she would fight with him. She banked the fire, tidied the kitchen, and then, instead of going to her cot, she pulled a blanket around her shoulders and sat in the chair by the door, determined to keep her own vigil. They were in this together. They were partners, and they would face whatever was coming, side by side. The days that followed were lived on a knife's edge. A heavy, oppressive watchfulness settled over the broken spur, poisoning the air. The simple, comforting sounds of the ranch, the lowing of cattle, the nicker of a horse, were now punctuated by a listening silence, a constant scanning of the horizon. Silas became a ghost, patrolling the vast boundaries of his land from before dawn until long after dusk. He grew leaner, harder, the lines around his eyes deepening. He rarely slept, catching an hour or two in a chair by the door, his rifle always within arm's reach. Alara's fear was a constant, cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a steely resolve. She refused to be a helpless victim cowering in the house. She took over more of the ranch chores, freeing him to focus on security. She learned to milk the cow, to feed the chickens, to mend a section of fence. Her hands, once soft, grew calloused and strong. She learned to handle a firearm. One afternoon, Silas took her out behind the barn. He placed a small pistol in her hand. It was heavy, cold, and felt utterly alien. "You need to know how to use this," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I can't be everywhere at once." His instruction was methodical, precise. He showed her how to load it, how to aim, how to control her breathing before squeezing the trigger. Her first shot was wide, the recoil shocking, the noise deafening. Her hands shook, but she loaded it again and again. She practiced every day, firing at tin cans set on a fence post until she could reliably hit her target, until the feel of the gun in her hand was no longer frightening, but simply a tool. The threat from Grissom and his men was not idle. It came in small, insidious ways. A section of fence would be cut in the night, and a dozen head of cattle would wander off, forcing Silas to spend a precious day rounding them up. A sack of feed in the barn was found slit open, its contents fouled. These were not direct confrontations, but acts of attrition, designed to wear him down, to make his life on the ranch untenable. Each incident chipped away at their resources and their spirits, a slow, creeping poison. One night, Alara was jolted awake by a strange orange light flickering against her wall. A smell, acrid and sharp, filled the air. Smoke. She scrambled from her cot, her heart seizing with terror. Rushing into the main room, she saw it through the window. The northern hay barn was engulfed in flames, a monstrous pyre lighting up the night sky. "Silas!" she screamed, her voice raw with panic. He was already moving, pulling on his boots, grabbing the rifle. "Stay here," he commanded, his face a grim mask in the hellish light. Bar the door. Do not come out. He ran out into the night, a lone figure charging toward the inferno. She watched from the window, her knuckles white as she gripped the sill. The fire was a living, roaring beast, consuming the barn, threatening to spread to the surrounding dry grass. She could see Silas and the two ranch hands, who had come running from the bunkhouse, working frantically to create a firebreak, their figures dwarfed by the towering flames. It was a diversion. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Cain had said it. Fire start. While Silas was occupied with the blaze, the main house would be vulnerable. Her blood ran cold. She grabbed the pistol from the mantelpiece, her hands surprisingly steady. She moved away from the window, pressing her back against the cold log wall beside the door, her eyes fixed on the entrance. The house was dark, the only light the demonic, flickering glow from the distant fire. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The only sounds were the frantic beating of her own heart and the faint, angry roar of the flames outside. Then she heard it, a soft scraping sound at the back of the house, by the small window in the pantry. Someone was trying to get in. Her breath caught in her throat. She was alone. Silas was too far away to help. This was it. The moment her training, her resolve, would be tested. She crept silently toward the pantry, the pistol held tight in both hands. The scraping stopped, followed by the faint creak of wood as the window was pried open. A dark shape began to climb through the small opening. Her mind went numb with terror, but her body moved on instinct, on the memory of Silas's calm, steady instructions. Control your breathing. Aim for the center of mass. Squeeze, don't pull. A man dropped to the floor inside the pantry. In the dim, reflected firelight, she saw his face. It was one of the men who had come with Cain. He had a knife in his hand and a cruel smile on his lips. He hadn't seen her yet. He took a step into the main room, his eyes scanning the space, looking for valuables, or perhaps for her. She raised the pistol. Her arms trembled, but her aim was true. Get out, she said, her voice a low, shaking command. The man froze, startled. He spun around, his eyes widening as he saw her, a small figure in a white nightgown, holding a gun on him. His surprise quickly turned to a sneer. Well, look what we have here, he rasped. The major's little pet. Put that down before you hurt yourself. Girl. He took a step toward her. It was the last mistake he would ever make. She didn't hesitate. She didn't think about the consequences. She thought of Silas fighting the fire. She thought of the home they had built. She thought of the word partner. She squeezed the trigger. The explosion was deafening in the confined space. The man staggered back, a look of pure shock on his face, a dark stain spreading across his chest. He crumpled to the floor and lay still. The smell of gunpowder was thick and acrid. Silence descended, absolute and terrifying. Alara stood frozen, the pistol still aimed at the fallen man, smoke curling from its barrel. The roar of the fire outside, the shouting of the men, it all seemed to be happening in another world. In this room, there was only the dead man, the echoing silence, and the shocking, final reality of what she had done. She had taken a life to defend her own. And in that terrible, transformative moment, the frightened girl who had stumbled onto this ranch months ago died forever. In her place stood a woman forged in fire and fear, a survivor who would not be broken. The world came rushing back in a torrent of sound and motion. The front door burst open, and Silas stood there, his face blackened with soot, his eyes wild. He took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance. Alara, pale and trembling but standing, the pistol in her hand, the body on the floor, the acrid smell of gunpowder. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice rough with urgency as he crossed the room in 2 long strides. She shook her head, unable to speak. The pistol suddenly felt impossibly heavy, and it slipped from her nerveless fingers, clattering onto the wooden floor. He didn't look at the dead man. His focus was entirely on her. He reached out, his hands hovering for a moment before they gently gripped her upper arms, as if to assure himself that she was real, that she was unharmed. His touch was an anchor in the swirling chaos of her mind. He came through the window, she stammered, the words catching in her throat. "I told him to get out. You did right," he said, his voice a low, fierce rumble. He pulled her into an embrace, crushing her against his chest. It was not a gentle, comforting hug. It was a desperate, possessive act, a raw expression of a terror he would never voice. She buried her face in his smoke-scented shirt, and a great, shuddering sob tore through her, the delayed shock finally breaking through her numbness. He held her tightly until the shaking subsided, his hand stroking her hair, his presence a solid wall against the horror of the night. The fire was eventually brought under control, though the hay barn was a total loss, its smoldering ruins a black scar against the dawn sky. The other ranch hands, their faces grim, dealt with the body of the intruder, wrapping it in a canvas and carrying it away without a word. The law was a distant, abstract concept out here. They would handle this themselves. As the first pale light of morning broke over the mountains, Silas and Alara sat at the long table in the main room. The coffee she had made sat untouched between them. The silence was different now. It was not the silence of routine or unspoken tension, but the profound quiet that follows a cataclysm. It was a silence of shared trauma, of a boundary crossed together. Alara stared at her hands, which were now scrubbed clean but still felt stained. She had taken a human life. The weight of it was a physical thing, a crushing pressure on her soul. She had expected to feel guilt, remorse, a deep and abiding horror. And while those things were present, they were overshadowed by a grim, unyielding sense of justification. She had protected her home. She had protected him. She felt no regret. The realization was as shocking as the act itself. She looked up and met Silas's gaze. He was watching her, his storm-gray eyes filled with a complex mixture of emotions she had never seen before: sorrow, pride, and a deep, aching tenderness. "This changes things," he said, his voice quiet. She knew he wasn't just talking about the feud with Grissom. He was talking about them. The lines between employer and cook, between rescuer and survivor, had been irrevocably blurred. The events of the night had stripped away all pretense, leaving only the raw truth of their connection. They were two solitary people who had found in each other a reason to fight, a reason to endure. "They'll be back," she said, her voice steady now. It wasn't a question. "Yes," he agreed. "Grissom won't let this go. He'll see this as an escalation, then we escalate," she said, the words surprising her with their coldness, their certainty. She saw a flicker of surprise in his eyes, followed by a slow, grim nod of respect. He reached across the table, his large, calloused hand covering hers. His touch was warm, firm, a silent vow. "We," he said, the word encompassing everything. It was a promise of allegiance, of a shared fate. In the quiet aftermath of the violence, in the smoky dawn of a new and more dangerous day, their partnership was forged anew, no longer in the heat of the kitchen stove, but in the crucible of fire and gunpowder. They were no longer just surviving alongside each other. They were standing together, a garrison of two against a hostile world. The sun rose higher, flooding the room with light, but it could not dispel the shadows of the night. The house was no longer just a shelter, it was a fortress, and they were its defenders. Alara looked at the man across from her, his hard face softened by the morning light, and she felt not fear for the future, but a strange and powerful sense of peace. Whatever came next, they would face it together. She was no longer alone. The months that followed the fire were a period of grim fortification. The broken spur transformed from a simple ranch into a defensible homestead. Silas, with the help of his two loyal hands and Alara, built stronger corrals and reinforced the doors and windows of the main house. Firing slits, thin horizontal openings just wide enough for a rifle barrel, were cut into the log walls, turning their home into a makeshift blockhouse. The work was hard and relentless, driven by the certainty that Kane and his men would return. The atmosphere of constant vigilance did not lessen. Every distant rider was a potential threat, every unexplained noise in the night a cause for alarm. But fear was tempered by a shared sense of purpose. They were no longer simply reacting, they were preparing. They were taking control of their own destiny. Alara's role on the ranch continued to expand. She became as adept with a rifle as she was with a skillet. She learned to track, her eyes becoming sharp to the subtle signs of passage on the land. She rode out with Silas on his patrols, the two of them moving across the vast landscape as a single, watchful unit. The silent companionship they shared on these long rides was more intimate than any conversation. They would communicate with a glance, a nod, a subtle gesture. He taught her the language of the land, and she, in turn, brought a measure of light back into his shadowed world. Her garden thrived, a vibrant patch of green and color that stood in defiance of the harshness surrounding them. She preserved the harvest, her shelves filling with jars of vegetables, a tangible symbol of their determination to endure, to build a future beyond the next threat. The change in Silas was profound. The rigid, solitary shell he had built around himself had been cracked open. He still spoke little, but his silences were now comfortable, filled with an easy understanding. He would watch her as she worked in her garden, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. He started carving in the evenings, small wooden figures of animals, a horse, a wolf, a hawk. He gave the first one, a carefully detailed songbird, to her. She kept it on the mantelpiece, a precious token of the gentle soul hidden beneath his granite exterior. One cool evening in late autumn, they stood on the porch together, watching the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and red. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and coming snow. For a week, there had been no sign of Grissom's men, a lull in the conflict that felt both like a relief and a prelude to a storm. "It's beautiful," Elara said softly, her gaze on the spectacular sky. "I used to hate this land. I thought it had taken everything from me." "It takes," Silas agreed, his voice a low rumble beside her. "But it gives, too. If you're strong enough to hold on." He turned to look at her, his face serious in the fading light. "You are strong, Elara," he said her name with a reverence that made her heart ache. It was the first time he had ever complimented her directly, and the simple words held more weight than 1,000 flowery speeches. "I learned from you," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't teach you strength," he said. "I only gave you a place to find your own." The space between them, once a vast chasm of silence and uncertainty, was now charged with a powerful, unspoken emotion. He took a step closer, his large frame seeming to shelter her from the vastness of the landscape. He reached out, his calloused thumb gently brushing a stray strand of hair from her cheek. The touch was electric, a spark in the twilight. His eyes, the color of a coming storm, searched her face, asking a question he still could not put into words. She gave him the answer without speaking, her own gaze clear and steady, her heart open to him. She leaned into his touch, a small, trusting movement that spoke volumes. He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. The kiss was not passionate or demanding. It was gentle, hesitant, a question and an answer all in one. It tasted of wood smoke, coffee, and a deep, lonely sorrow finally finding solace. It was a kiss of profound gratitude, of shared survival, of a love that had grown slowly and quietly in the harshest of soils, like a resilient wildflower on a rocky cliff. When they broke apart, the last light of the sun had faded, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the velvet sky. They didn't need to speak. Everything that needed to be said had been communicated in that single, transformative moment. They were no longer just partners in survival. They were partners in life. Hand in hand, they turned and walked back into the warm, fire-lit house, their house, ready to face the long, dark night and whatever future it might hold, together. The threat of Grissom still loomed over them, a shadow on the horizon, but it no longer seemed as daunting. They had found something precious and unbreakable in each other, a strength that was more than the sum of its parts. They had found a home, not just in the log walls of the ranch house, but in each other. And for that, they would fight to the end. The final confrontation came, as they knew it would, with the first heavy snow of winter. A blizzard descended on the territory, a swirling white fury that isolated the broken spur completely. It was under the cover of this storm that Grissom made his move, assuming the weather would provide the perfect camouflage for his final, decisive assault. They had been expecting it. A scout Silas had sent to the nearest town had returned 2 days prior with a warning. Grissom had hired a dozen armed men, hard cases from the mining camps, and was boasting that he would own the broken spur by Christmas. The blizzard was not a hindrance, it was the signal. They were prepared. The 2 ranch hands, loyal men who had chosen their side, were armed and stationed in the reinforced barn. Elara and Silas were in the main house. The windows were shuttered, the doors barred. The firing slits were open, dark mouths in the log walls. They sat in the dim, fire-lit room, the silence broken only by the howl of the wind and the crackle of the logs in the hearth. They had spent the day making their final preparations, moving with a calm, efficient purpose. Now, there was nothing left to do but wait. "I never thought," Alara began, her voice quiet but clear in the charged silence, "the day my family's wagon broke, that my life would lead me here." Silas looked at her, his face grim but his eyes soft. "I never thought I'd have a life to lead again," he confessed, the admission a rare glimpse into the depths of his past. "Before you came, I was just existing, waiting for the end. You brought this place back to life, Alara. You brought me back to life. We saved each other," she said, and it was the simplest, most profound truth. A sudden volley of shots from the direction of the barn shattered the night. The attack had begun. Silas moved to a firing slit on the east wall, Alara to one on the south. Peering through the narrow opening, she could see dark shapes moving through the swirling snow, men on foot advancing toward the house, using the blizzard for cover. The battle was a chaotic, terrifying symphony of sound and fury. The sharp crack of rifles, the splintering of wood as bullets slammed into the log walls, the muffled shouts of men, all against the ceaseless, screaming backdrop of the wind. Alara fired the rifle, the recoil jolting her shoulder. She had no specific target, only the moving shadows in the white chaos. She loaded and fired with a mechanical precision, her fear a cold, hard stone in her gut, but her hands steady. This was not the panicked self-defense of the first time. This was a calculated act of war. They were outnumbered, but they had the advantage of fortification. The log walls held strong, absorbing the bullets. The attackers, exposed to the elements and the defenders' fire, began to fall. The battle raged for what felt like an eternity. A lantern in the barn was hit and exploded, and for a terrifying moment, Alara thought it would go up in flames again. But the snow was too thick, and the fire sputtered and died. Through it all, Silas was a calming presence. He moved between the firing slits, his shots measured and deadly, his voice occasionally cutting through the din. "They're trying to flank us from the west. Hold your fire. Let them get closer." He was the major again, a commander in his element, his military training rising to the surface. Alara felt a surge of pride in him, in his strength and his leadership. Then came a new sound, a heavy, rhythmic thudding against the front door. They were using a battering ram. "Alara, the hearth." Silas yelled. She understood immediately. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace, its end glowing a bright, angry orange. The door began to splinter, the heavy bar holding it groaning in protest. With a final, sickening crack, the door burst inward, and 3 men surged into the room, their faces illuminated by the firelight. Before they could even raise their weapons, Silas was on them, his rifle used as a club. He moved with a brutal, terrifying efficiency. At the same time, Alara plunged the glowing poker into the chest of the third man, who had been momentarily stunned by the ferocity of Silas's attack. The man screamed, a horrifying, inhuman sound, as he fell back, clutching his smoldering coat. The fight was short and savage. When it was over, 3 more of Grissom's men lay dead or dying on the floor of their home. The remaining attackers, their will broken by the ferocity of the defense and the loss of their comrades, faltered. Their fire slackened, and then, one by one, the shadowy figures began to retreat back into the swirling blizzard, phantoms swallowed by the storm. Silence fell, broken only by the moaning of the wind and the pained gasps of a wounded man. It was over. They had won. Alara leaned against the wall, her body trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion. The room was a wreck, the floor littered with bodies and debris, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. But they were alive. Silas stood in the center of the room, his chest heaving, his face a grim tableau of the savage fight. He looked at her, and his gaze was filled with a fierce, burning pride. They had faced the worst, and they had endured. They had held their ground. They had defended their home. As the first light of dawn struggled to penetrate the blizzard, casting a pale, ethereal glow over the snow-covered landscape, they stood together on the porch, looking out at the aftermath of the battle. The world was white and still, the snow covering the scars of the fight, offering a clean slate. The war with Grissom was over. He would not be back. They had proven that the broken spur was not a prize to be taken, but a home to be defended, and that its owners would not be broken. The cost had been high, but in the crucible of that violent night, their future had been forged, hard and bright and undeniable. The harsh land had tested them, and they had been found worthy.